Welcome to Off the Page, the show where we talk with Colorado authors to get the story behind the story. My name is Stacy McKenzie. I'm a librarian here at Mamie Dowd Eisenhower Public Library in Broomfield. And today we have Johanna Parkhurst on the show today with her two books. Johanna, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
We have two wonderful books that we're going to talk about. But first, let's talk about you a little bit. What are you doing when you're not being an author?
Yeah, great question. So I actually am a trained teacher, and I've been working in middle school education for the last 11 years. And people always ask, like, well, how does that work out, teaching and writing at the same time? And I always joke that the minute I leave teaching, I will no longer have anything to write about because I write young adult, and all of my best ideas tend to come from things I'm watching my students go through, or ideas that they have, or things that they're telling me about and want books about. So it's a really wonderful balance of careers for me, and I really, really enjoy it.
So you really are kind of living what you write, because sometimes I think it must be difficult for an adult to write young adult, but you've got all that material right in front of you.
I mean, I think it really helps a lot. One of the hardest things I find as an adult writer, writing young adult, is making sure the voice is right. And I think most adult writers who work in the young adult world say that voice is a really important piece of it. So I pay a lot of attention to how vernacular changes and the way my students are speaking and the way they talk to each other. And obviously, like, teen language changes as fast as adult language does, and that's one of the hardest things to keep up with. So it really is just nice to kind of have a constant pulse on what's changing and moving in that world. And also just to see how teenagers are changing all the time, just because social media is changing the world as we know it, so they're constantly changing along with it. And it's nice to feel like I have some insight into that world as we go along, and the world keeps changing.
And figuring out what's hip and cool and what the right, like you said, the voice, the words, they change constantly. Do you just jot things down all day?
Not so much, actually. It's more like I'll just replay conversations that I heard in my head. I'll go home and I'll like think about, oh, like, what did I hear students talking about in the lunchroom today? Or, you know, what were my students in homeroom discussing this morning? And very often I'm far behind the times in what I think they're talking about.
Okay.
And then when I start tuning in and paying more attention to things, like for a specific book, this happened a lot with every Inferno, because there's a couple scenes in there where, you know, JJ, the main character, is getting in trouble a lot, and I was trying to think, like, how do my students talk to their parents really about, like, when things are going wrong at school? So I started tuning in more to the way they would talk to me about, well, I have to tell my dad this happened. And I actually remember changing a lot of the language in that book based on just different, not even vernacular so much, but just as like the tone they would use when speaking to their parents and how their parents would respond and things like that.
So it's an evolving, as you're writing the book, you're kind of learning as you go.
Yeah, Zeb Pike is the funniest example of that, because I started Here's to You, Zeb Pike 10 years before it saw publication. And I went through periods where I wasn't working on it and periods where I was. But you can imagine what changed in 10 years. When I started writing that book, the internet was not what it was today. Like, texting was barely what it was today. Like, most of my students didn't even have cell phones then, or not like the cell phones that they have now. So when that book was finally getting to a place where I knew I wanted to do more with it, over the course of, I joke, but it's true, I think I rewrote that book 46 times. Over the course of every single rewrite, I had to update like what students were talking about and the ways that they were talking. One of those students is a big skateboarder, and I would say the only thing that probably stayed the same in that book is I actually had my students, when I first started writing it, they taught me skateboarding terms. I actually have notes that they wrote me of skateboarding terms and how to like write about them. That was probably the only thing that never had to change in that book, because most of the lingo I used just apparently never changed. But everything else had to change over and over again. I had to add in texting and all these things. It was really odd.
I imagine that would be so hard to keep up with. Let's go back to when you were a child. Now, you mentioned Vermont. And you grew up in Vermont. Tell me about what it was like growing up in Vermont. Was it different than today's teenagers have it?
You know, it's interesting. A lot of people ask why I set my books in Vermont. Zeb Pike was set partly in Colorado, where I was teaching, and partly in Vermont, where I was a teen. Every Inferno was entirely in Vermont, where I was a teen. And I think it's because the place just feels very familiar, and it's easy to think about what I was like as a teen and then put my characters in there. But the comparisons really stop there, because I had a very, very unique childhood. I grew up on a dairy farm, which meant that I was up every morning at like 4 a.m. milking cows, or milking cows at night after I got home from school. Just not the normal childhood that even my characters have. Right. I often tell my mom that one day I'm going to write that story, and I'm going to write a character who lives on his parents' dairy farm or her parents' dairy farm. I haven't written it yet. But it's so unique and so different that part of me, I don't feel like meshes with any of the characters I've yet written, because it's just a very different world. And it is idyllic in some ways. It's beautiful. Vermont's very small. One of the things that I really liked about writing Every Inferno, which is set entirely there, is I was really trying to capture that sort of small town feel that a lot of places in Vermont have, where it's easy to know people, and it's easy to just get around and meet people, and it's easy to realize what is going on with the people around you. Kind of the same with Here's to You, Zeb Pike. So I was trying to capture that, and at the same time make sure that I was adding in the fact that these places are very different than they were when I was growing up, and they're not exactly the same. So,
well, let's jump right to Vermont and talk about Every Inferno. Give me an idea what this book is about.
Yeah, so Every Inferno is my second book. Every Inferno is probably the darker of the two books that I've written. It was written at a time when I was working with a lot of students who were dealing with grief, with loss of loved ones, and I was watching them struggle through the process of trying to just figure out how to go about everyday life when they've lost somebody, and I wanted to write a book that really touched on those subjects. So JJ was born. JJ is my most tortured character, probably will ever be. He was in a movie theater fire with his parents when he was 5. He was severely injured in the fire, and his parents were killed. And the book opens with JJ having dreams about the arsonist who killed his parents. So it's got a mystery element to it. I say that it's not a full-on mystery because there's a lot of other things going on. JJ's figuring out his sexuality. He's just met this boy named McKinley who he thinks he might have feelings for, but he's not quite sure. And there's a lot of other things going on in his life. He's doing horribly in school because he can't seem to move on from everything that's happened to him, and he's constantly in trouble. When the book opens, he's just like released all the frogs out of the science lab because he's decided to set them free. So he's always in trouble. But he starts having these dreams about the person he thinks killed his parents, and he decides that he's going to try and solve the mystery of who started this famous movie theater fire. So the book is sort of a mesh of all those different plot lines.
And how old is your main character in that book?
JJ's 15. JJ also struggles with alcoholism, which is something a lot of people have asked me why I chose to write about that. I feel like teenage alcoholism isn't something that gets talked about a lot, just like teenage drug abuse isn't something that everybody necessarily wants to talk about. And I've definitely worked with teenagers, even younger than JJ, 13, who were starting to drink and discover alcohol and drugs and weren't really, there's not a lot of access to great material out there about like, what do you do if if you end up becoming an addict at such a young age? So I actually put JJ through a lot in this book. So JJ kind of goes through the process of trying to figure out like, what has happened? How have I become? Am I an addict? Is this something? Do I have a problem? And what do I do about it? So yeah, he's a little older. He's 15. Although like I said, I have definitely worked with students who are younger who are struggling with those issues. And my main character in Here's to You, Zeb Pike is 14. So they're both in high school.
Wow. Complicated storyline. It sounds great. Let's talk about Every Inferno. What's that book about?
That one's a little lighter in some ways. That one's about 3 siblings. The main character is Dusty, who are living in Colorado Springs, right in the kind of shadows of Pikes Peak, hence the title. And the whole story really starts when basically the 3 of them get caught. And when I say get caught, what I essentially mean is they've been living without parents on and off for years. Their mother has a tendency to disappear. She'll just go away for weeks at a time, and Dusty just takes care of the kids. And they've been hiding this from school officials and people for a very long time. And when the book opens, his sister comes down with appendicitis, and the hospital officials realize that something's going on. So they get shipped across the country to live with their aunt and uncle in Vermont. And most of the story really kind of works around them trying to figure out, like, what is this crazy new environment we've been dropped into where there are small towns? And Dusty is trying to figure out the fact that he thinks he might have feelings for this hockey player named Emmett, who he really likes, but he's in Vermont and he doesn't know what's going on. And his brother and sister seem to like it there, but he's desperate to get them back to Colorado. And he really just wants his family back. So he spends a lot of time and energy trying to get his parents back, and that's sort of his big conflict throughout the book.
Wow, great deep subjects for the kiddos. I have to ask, who were your writing influences? Did they play a role in these books?
I think I've had so many. And I mean, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, which is such a weird heyday for young adult literature. I think a lot of people forget some of the great young adult authors that were really doing amazing things during that time, like Paula Donziger, who now mostly does stuff for younger kids. She was a huge influence on me. And she was all about doing what I've heard another writer called making the small big and making the big small. Like, she would take a subject like a teenager's parents divorcing and make it this huge, beautiful book full of humor and just angst, but in a really like funny way. She was magical. If I ever meet Paula Donziger, I'll probably cry.
Oh, wow.
And she, I kind of studied at the feet of her. I kind of studied at the feet of Judy Blume, who, everything Judy Blume's ever written is like, you wouldn't think that a person getting their period would be a very big deal, but here's an entire book about it, and it's beautiful. Are you there, Goddess Be Margaret?
That's right.
So yeah, I sort of studied at the feet of all these authors who could take very small moments in teenagers' lives and explode them. And I think that's really important because, especially as a teenager, I just remember feeling this way. You always kind of feel like your whole life is that moment. Like there's never going to be anything bigger. This is all so important. The now is so important. And that's okay. And when that's the case, you need to be able to read about other characters who feel that way, who feel like this may appear small to other people, but it's huge to me.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely, something that I want to spend 50,000 words writing about because it's huge to them.
And is that one of the things you keep in mind when you're writing specifically for a YA audience? Are there other things that you want to relate with them?
Yeah, I don't know. I think I just try to pick subjects that I think will be interesting for them and things that I think they are legitimately going through. A lot of people ask me why I ended up writing 2 books with gay characters. And while it kind of at first happened by accident, there's a long story involving how that character initially had no relationship, and then he and Emmett were this perfect couple, and I was like, they just have to be together. It was very weird. But beyond that, at the same time I was writing both of these books, especially the first one, I was working with a lot of students who were struggling with coming out. And at that time, when I first started teaching, it was not easy to get books about LGBTQ kids in libraries. Like, they were just not everywhere. Alex Sanchez was kind of the only one who was really doing it on the scene. And even his books, you couldn't find them in a lot of libraries. So during my entire writing process, I was working while publishing was changing, and I wanted to be part of that. I wanted to put books on shelves that kids I knew needed, and I knew a lot of kids who needed books about kids who just weren't automatically straight.
Yeah.
And I also wanted to write books specifically about kids who, that was just a subplot. It wasn't their entire life. They had other things going on, but that was also, it mattered to them, and it was something that they were thinking about and going through.
And have you had criticism about that from people who don't feel like that's appropriate to be written about in a YA book?
No, not at all, actually. I mean, I work specifically with a publisher who publishes books about LGBTQ characters, and my publisher actually sprang out during that kind of era in publishing when I work with a smaller publisher, when the bigger publishers were not putting out a lot of books about LGBTQ characters. And actually the percentage, if you look at it, I've seen breakdowns of this, is still very small. Most of the characters published in YA are still straight, heteronormative. Which obviously we just need to have more diversity in young adult literature, period, on a wide variety of levels. So my publisher has always been like, this is our thing. We want to get strong positive messaging out to all students, all children across the spectrum who are looking for characters that they can relate to. Yeah, and I don't know, I talk to a lot of kids about my books just because I'm in schools all the time.
Yeah.
And I think for the most part I've had overwhelmingly really, really positive feedback. I think, the world is changing in a lot of great ways, and there's a lot of opportunities for kids to express themselves in ways that they couldn't 11 years ago when I started teaching, and I think they really appreciate having books that reflect the things they're thinking about.
I agree. Another interesting thing I found about this book is, they're male characters.
Yeah.
They're boys. How did you change your voice to make that transition?
Yeah, I'm not sure how they both ended up being boys. It actually wasn't something I necessarily set out to do. I think it's because I actually had some real life influences, some students I was working with who influenced Dusty, a couple of different people, and they all happened to be boys. So that just sort of happened. And then JJ, the students I was dealing with who were struggling the most with grief, also happened to be boys. So that just happened, and I modeled a lot of their voices very specifically on male people that I was working with in schools. I actually very much do want my next main character. We will talk about this, I'm sure. The companion to that first book is coming out next year, so that's also going to be a male voice. But my next book after that, I really do want to do some more exploration with writing some female characters, just because it's actually something I've done far less of than you would imagine, considering that I myself am a female.
It's interesting. That's just an interesting little aspect about that. So, because these books are so different, one a little lighter than the other, some of the settings are different, who is the ideal audience for these books, and is it different between them?
I think so. I get that question a lot, especially when I'm talking to students, and I always tell them if you want that really dark story that's going to like make you cry, make you think, like this is the one to go for. If you like mystery and a little more action, like this is the one to go for. If you like the little more like dark, sarcastic, kind of brooding but funny type of YA lit, that's really more of the one to go for.
Okay.
And I think they play very differently to different audiences. I've had a lot of people be like, I didn't really like Seb Pike, but I loved every Inferno. And other students and adults tell me that every Inferno was like by far their favorite. And very rarely do people say that they like them equally.
Okay.
Which doesn't surprise me because they're so different. So I think it really just depends what you're looking for on that day of the week.
So your students you are associated with have actually read the books.
Yeah, I am really lucky. The most fabulous cheerleaders in the world are actually my colleagues, and they were just so excited when I was first published that they started like ordering my books for their classrooms and handing them out to students. And it's been a lot of fun. I actually also had a very strange opportunity when I was back in Vermont. This was probably last year, visiting my mother, who still works and teaches there. Their students had read the books because my mother obviously gave them to them, and they wanted me to come in and talk to them. So I went in and I talked to a lot of students, and what they loved about it was this book are set in the towns they live in, essentially. So they had all these questions about like, is this the movie theater down the street, and what's this? And it's a lot of fun. I really enjoy hearing from readers. I say that on my website. I say that every time I go speak at a conference or anywhere, that if you're a reader, like definitely reach out. I would love to hear what you think, because I really enjoy hearing feedback, especially from young readers.
Oh, that's fabulous. I bet you will. And it's just so much fun, probably, to have your book promoted. You didn't even try. That's marvelous.
Yeah, I mean, my colleagues are easily my best cheerleaders in the world. They're so funny about it. You should read this. Miss Parkhurst wrote it. And I'm like, oh, okay, thanks.
Perfect. Well, you mentioned your publisher earlier. Tell me, who is your publisher? And do they mostly publish books like yours, or what is their genre?
Yeah, so both of these two books specifically are published by Harmony Ink Press, and they're a publisher that specifically looks to publish books about characters on the LGBTQ spectrum. So their sort of mission was to put more positive literature about and sort of like bridge the diversity in YA lit through that specific market. So yeah, they're very focused. I don't know that every book I ever write will work for them because of that, but I think I'm just so glad they exist out there in the marketplace. I'm so glad that they're doing that, because like I said, when I started doing this 11 years ago, when I started working with kids, it was just not easy to find books with LGBTQIA characters out there. And I'm so grateful that Harmony and some other publishers have started to fill in that gap, and the bigger publishers and publishers kind of across the range are working to improve that gap. It's really great to see.
And the publishing process, as a cold, dry process, how did that work for you? Sometimes I hear that writing is the easy part and the publishing is kind of tough.
Yeah, for me it was so exciting. I mean, I don't think I'll ever forget the day when that book finally sold and it got contracted, because it had been, from start to finish, 10 years. So it was absolutely crazy to sign the contract for that book and just say, like, this is actually going to be a real book in print that people can read. It's nuts. So I think I was just kind of like in a daze the entire time that one was going through. And it's a really interesting process. I tell my kids all the time that, you've never seen true editing until you've worked with like multiple professional editors who are like arguing about you with commas obsessively and like sending you line edits that are like every single line is like, we want this, changed and moved and directed. And for me, it's great because I really love constructive criticism in my writing. I love being able to improve as a writer. And I also just really enjoy having that back and forth with people about my books. So I loved it from start to finish, but it was definitely a whirlwind. And it's definitely one of those things that I think for the third book, when the third book comes out next year, I'll be able to like actually process it a little more, because these two came out very quickly. That one sold and this one sold right after it. They almost went as like, it was close to a package deal. So both processes went really fast.
Well, that's actually okay. I guess you'll have more experience under your belt with the next one.
Yeah, I hope so. And I hope the next one will be better. I hope every book I ever write, they just get better and better and better.
And so Here's to You, Zeb Pike took 10 years to write?
Well, I mean, on and off. I started it the first year I started teaching, and in my 10th year of teaching was when I finally sold it. It was probably like 6 years on and off of me like giving up on it, working on other things, letting it go, that book was rejected so many times by so many agents and publishers. I've lost count, but I think it was rejected at least 85 times.
Okay, all right.
I
That's
used
a
to
good
save
lesson.
all my rejection letters. I mean, I tell students all the time, especially my writing students, like, you need to learn early and often that like writing just gets better and better the more you do it, and your first draft is probably never going to be your best draft. Right. There might be a few writers out there who get really lucky with that, but I don't think that's the majority of people. Yeah, so it was getting rejected left and right. It was a really long process. I'd given it up from time to time. And then actually the breakthrough for me really, ironically, it was the Amazon Breakthrough Novel Award, which is this award that Amazon.com does for new authors, where essentially if you've written a manuscript, you can send it in and they pick like their top 50 and it's a really public contest, so a lot of agents and publishers see it. And that book happened to land in like the top, I forget what, but it was a semifinalist or something like that. And after that, all of a sudden I stopped getting rejection letters and I started getting letters of interest. And that was what really kind of flipped everything for me.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
So that's terrific. Amazon, that everybody's heard about, recognized your book, and of course that made it a little more exciting for everybody, of course.
That was a fun ride and a very cool experience.
Now, you've talked about a few suggestions that you give to aspiring writers. What's one big piece of advice that you'd like to give them?
It's so cliche because everyone says it, but you just can't stop writing. I think one of the biggest mistakes I made is when that book was first getting rejected a lot, I actually stopped writing for probably like a year and a half, just because I was very depressed. I wasn't sure if this was going anywhere. You know, I was like, maybe this just isn't the career for me. And now I really regret it because that was a year and a half when I could have been churning out amazing things and doing wonderful things. Like, you just have to write through it. You know, there's Malcolm Gladwell talks about the 10,000 hour rule. It takes 10,000 hours to be great at anything. You just have to do the work. You have to write for the 10,000 hours and get a lot of good feedback along the way and seek out the criticism and take the criticism and not let it shut you down and just keep going. And I really do think that's the key.
Well, when you stopped for a year and a half, what brought you back to it?
I think it's just always been in my blood. Like, I've been writing stories and telling stories since I was 8 years old, and I just missed it. You know, this for so many years was my hobby. It was what I did, you know, all summer when, you know, we were on breaks from teaching, and it's what I did every day when I came home and just kind of needed that relaxation activity. I love it. You know, I still don't really think of it as a job so much. It's just like what I do for fun, which is a little strange, but it's what I do for fun.
Which makes it even more fun when you get recognized for it. Or
it
when
really
you're
does. It's actually a great way to be. I couldn't give it up. I had to come back to it eventually, and Dusty called me back.
Well, I want to make sure that people know what to expect. You have a website.
Yes.
And what can people find when they go to your website?
Yeah, definitely. I hope people visit the website. It's just johannaparkhurst.com, pretty easy to find. And I try to keep it pretty simple. There's some blurbs about both the books, buy links, so if people are interested in buying them, they can do that. There's an excerpt from every Inferno on there if you want to read a little bit of the beginning, you know, just kind of test the waters on that one. And then I try to keep up a blog, which is a lot of me just kind of rambling about whatever random thing, but I actually write about why I lit a lot in there. Most of my posts, I would say 80% of them tend to concentrate on either something with education or something with books. So actually one of the most recent posts I wrote was my YA summer reading list, which is all the young adult books I was hoping to read this summer. I'm only a third of the way through. Okay. It's okay, I've still got some weeks to go.
You've got some time.
I'm gonna get there. So I do a lot of things with that. And then for the most part, I'm trying to think if there's anything else. It is, like I said, really simple. I think there's a video of me on there talking about every Inferno. There's some bio information. There's a way to contact me if you're interested in contacting me.
And are you available for like book talks and maybe library visits if people want to contact you through your website?
Definitely. I love speaking with teenagers. I love speaking with adults about writing. I think I just feel very lucky to be in a position where I have books that are out there in the world that other people are reading, and I absolutely love talking about it, and I love meeting people who I've either read my books or are just interested in talking to a writer.
Well, and people who love the books, you mentioned a little teaser here. So you're having a second part of Here's to You, Zeb Pike?
Yes, this was really exciting for me because that book, there were days when I was not sure it was going to come to fruition. So Dusty's sort of love interest in that book, his name is Emmett. And Emmett was always one of my favorite characters to write, and I very much wanted to write a book from Emmett's perspective. But I really struggled with it for years, and I wasn't sure I was ever going to finish it. And it's really exciting. It's finished. It's been sold. It's coming out next December, 2016. Okay. And the title is, I'm not sharing the title yet, but it's going to be a companion. So it's what happens after that book. It's kind of a standalone. You don't need to have read that one to read the next one, but the next one's told from Emmett's perspective, and it's his story. Oh. And I'm very excited, and it's what comes after the events that happen in this book.
That's very exciting. Is there going to be a third and a fourth and a fifth? Are we going to see a series here?
Probably not. I think that's probably where that one will end. Like I said, I really want to, there's some other projects I'm sort of in the works on right now. I'm really excited about the next YA book that I'm working on, which will hopefully have a female protagonist. So I think that's going to probably be the end of those boys. And people always ask if there's going to be a sequel to every Inferno, and that one's pretty much done. I feel like that story sealed up pretty nicely at the end, and I wouldn't want to try and take it apart. But yeah, I am very excited. December of 2016.
Oh, we're excited too. And you mentioned other projects, and they sound like they're kind of just floating around. You know, how for someone who is an aspiring writer, you've got a lot of ideas. How do you nail those down? How do you get on a forward motion?
I have to be pretty disciplined about it just because I'm also a teacher, so I have limited time. So I actually have a very set schedule of like when I write, when I get up. So I try to get up really early in the morning. Usually I aim for no later than 5. Some days I make that and some days I don't.
That's those Vermont days. Yes.
And then I'll write for, an hour and a half or so before I have to go to work or whatever it is. And then I have like set hours on the weekends. So I'm very disciplined about it. I try to plot out my projects ahead of time. I know when new projects are going to start, when my editing cues and things like that are going to happen with publishers. And I try to be very disciplined about the whole thing. Sometimes that works better than others. But I think another thing I often tell aspiring writers is something that really changed things for me was doing National Novel Writing Month, which is in November. So up until I did National Novel Writing Month, I was really bad at meeting what they called word count goals of like saying, I'm actually going to write 3,000 words. I was much more loosey-goosey about it. I was much more like, I will write when the words come to me, and if I sit here for half an hour, then that will be fine. And it often slowed down my process. It meant that I was always like editing as I was going, which sometimes you're kind of like shutting yourself down creatively when you do that. So National Novel Writing Month, when I did it, this was probably 2 years ago, actually changed my entire writing process because it forced me to say, no, I'm going to write 2,500 words today. Even if they are the worst things I've ever written, I'm going to write them. And it just really made me an even more disciplined writer. I'd always been what I call a binge writer before that, where I would write these like huge chunks of things and then like not look at it again for a week. And sometimes I still do that, but I am now much better when I want to set daily goals at being able to do that. So yes, I think my binge writing days, as much as I still do that, are a little more behind me. And apologies to all the college professors who tried to train me out of that years ago, and I wasn't having it.
It's not going to happen. Yeah.
I've been won over.
That's good. Wow, that's a fascinating process, and every writer has a different process.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being on the show, Johanna. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. I had a wonderful time. It's been a pleasure.
I want to thank my author, Johanna Parkhurst, for being on the show today with her books, Every Inferno, and Here's to You, Zeb Bike. Check your local libraries for the books that we talked about on today's show, and join us for more next time on Off the Page.